Okay, let's dive in. When you think about cleaning up the environment, big scale stuff like contaminated soil or oil spills, or even just managing wastewater day to day, we tend to picture, huge machines or maybe complex chemical plants. But something like the Deepwater Horizon spill really showed us that the real engine behind environmental decontamination, it's microscopic. It's largely microbial.
It really is. And what's so interesting is that getting clean water, whether it's for your tap or dealing with industrial waste, it pulls in so many fields, geology, biochemistry, physics. It's all connected. So our mission today really is to explore these invisible microbial systems. We want to look at how microbes help with two goals that seem almost opposite, getting water super pure, but also generating resources like energy from waste.
Exactly. So for you listening, we're going to try and map out the key ideas from our source material here. We'll focus on how these microbes actually work, the mechanisms and the science behind environmental health and biotechnology. Let's start with the basics, making sure the water from your tap is actually safe to drink.
Yeah, safe drinking water is fundamental. And purification is absolutely critical because, well, the EPA lists quite a few microbial threats. We're talking certain bacteria, viruses, and some really tough ones like the protozoans, Giardia, and Cryptosporidium. They're notoriously hard to get rid of.
Right. So to tackle those, water treatment usually follows a sequence of steps, starting with physical barriers. First up is sedimentation and coagulation. Municipalities have these big holding basins where heavy stuff settles out naturally, but that doesn't get the really fine particles, so they add chemicals.
That's right, things
Yeah.
like alum and lime.
Yeah.
It's a process called flocculation. These chemicals, they're coagulants. They basically disrupt the charges on tiny suspended particles, bits of organic matter, even microbes allowing them to stick together. They form these larger clumps called flocks.
Ah, flocks, got it. So they get heavy and then they settle out more easily in those basins.
Exactly. It clarifies the water significantly.
Okay, so after that partial clarification, what's next? Step two.
Step 2 is filtration. Usually this involves rapid sand filters. Water's pushed pretty quickly through beds of sand. The grains are maybe a millimeter across, and this physically traps a lot of what's left, up to, say, 99% of bacteria.
99% just from sand.
Primarily physical trapping, yes. But there's another type, slow sand filters. These are different, more biological. Water moves very slowly through the sand, and the top layer is covered in this thick, slimy microbial layer, a biofilm. And here's a key idea that keeps coming up. Environmental cleaning often relies on stickiness. In these slow filters, microbes are mainly removed because they stick to that biofilm.
Okay, so the biofilm itself cleans the water, and you're saying that combination coagulation and filtration that's really important for catching those tough ones, like the Giardia and Cryptosporidium cysts.
Absolutely. Those cysts are quite resistant, so you need both steps to reliably remove them.
Right. Then we get to the final, maybe most crucial step, disinfection. This is usually chlorine or ozone.
Typically, yes. And our sources point out a specific requirement in the U.S. for chlorine. You need enough to leave what's called a residual-free chlorine level, about 0.2 to 2.0 milligrams per liter in the water after treatment.
That residual, that's to keep the water safe all the way through the pipes to my house, right? But hang on, you also mentioned this creates disinfection byproducts, DBPs, things like trihalomethanes, which might be carcinogenic. So we're kind of swapping immediate threats for potential long-term ones. How is that balance struck?
That's the big trade-off, isn't it? Pathogens like cholera cause immediate, widespread, potentially devastating illness. DBPs are a concern, absolutely, but the risk is generally considered much lower and more chronic. The global consensus is pretty clear. The benefit of killing off those dangerous acute pathogens with chlorine far outweighs the known risks from DBPs at the levels usually found. It's a necessary risk calculation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, about checking the water quality. Testing for every single pathogen sounds impossible, so they use indicator organisms.
Exactly. Things like coliform bacteria, they act as an index if you find them. It suggests possible fecal contamination, meaning other more dangerous pathogens could be present.
How do they use to test for those?
The traditional method was the multiple tube fermentation test. It was quite involved. You'd set up lots of lactose broth tubes, do a series of tests, presumptive, confirmed, completed, and end up calculating a most probable number, or MPN. The whole thing could take up to 4 days.
4 days. Wow. That feels incredibly slow if you're worried about contaminated water people are drinking now.
It was a major limitation, which is why newer methods like the defined substrate test Colilert is a common example were such a breakthrough.
How does that work? Faster.
Much faster and simpler. You use just one 100 milliliter sample. The test medium has specific chemicals, ONPG, for instance, turns yellow if general coliforms are present because they break it down. And for fecal coliforms, like E. coli, there's another substrate, MUGI. If E. coli is there, it breaks down MUG and the sample glows, it fluoresces under UV light. You get clear results much, much faster.
A game changer for public health response times, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's switch gears now to wastewater. Kind of the opposite problem, taking dirty water and cleaning it up. And before we get into the how, the source material really emphasizes the massive impact of wastewater treatment on public health. It says, alongside vaccines and antibiotics, wastewater management is responsible for most of the big gains in human lifespan over the last century. That's huge.
It is staggering and really puts into perspective the fact that globally, something like 40% of people still lack basic sanitation. It's a critical issue. Treating wastewater is tough because it's a messy mix, lots of organic matter, sometimes heavy metals, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, plus all sorts of solids.
So how do they tackle that? The treatment involves stages again.
Yes, typically 3 main stages, often physically separated. Primary treatment is first and is purely physical. Think screens to catch large objects, then settling tanks where solids sink down. This collected solid material, that's called sludge.
Okay, just getting the big stuff out. What's next?
Secondary treatment. This is where the microbes really do the heavy lifting. It's biological. The main goal here is to use microbes growing either with oxygen, aerobically, or without it, anaerobically, to break down most of the dissolved organic stuff, the DOM. They convert about 90–95% of it into more microbial cells, so biomass and carbon dioxide.
And does that stickiness principle, flocculation, come back into play here?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial again. For efficient treatment, you need the microbes to clump together into those stable, settleable flocks. Sometimes in wastewater treatment, they call this granular sludge. If the sludge doesn't clump and settle well, they call that bulking sludge. The whole system gets inefficient and backed up. Getting good granular sludge means you need less space, maybe 75% less, and it can cut treatment costs by up to 25%. It's a big deal.
So how do they encourage that? Are there different setups?
Yeah, there are variations. The classic aerobic one is the activated sludge system, where wastewater flows through tanks and some of the settled sludge is recycled back to keep the microbial population high. There's also the trickling filter, where wastewater trickles over rocks or plastic media covered in biofilm, that sticky layer again.
You also mentioned something about reducing the amount of sludge itself, an extended process.
Right, the extended aeration process. This is used when minimizing the final sludge volume is really important. They aerate the wastewater for a very long time. Eventually, the microbes run out of the incoming food, the DOM. So to get energy just to stay alive for maintenance, they start consuming their own biomass. It's like you're forcing them to cannibalize themselves, which reduces the net amount of sludge produced.
Okay, interesting. So after secondary treatment, you've got cleaner water, but also all that sludge collected from primary and secondary steps. What happens to that?
That sludge typically goes into anaerobic digestion. This happens in a sealed tank, without oxygen. There are 3 key things going on inside. First, fermentation. Microbes break down complex organic molecules in the sludge into simpler organic acids like acetate. Second, other microbes produce precursors like CO2 and hydrogen gas. And third, the crucial step, methanogenesis. This is carried out by archaea, a different domain of life, from bacteria, which take those simple acids, CO2 and hydrogen, and convert them into methane, CH4, natural gas.
Ah, methane. So you're actually generating energy from the waste.
Exactly. That methane is often captured and burned right there at the plant to produce heat or electricity. That's a resource recovery step. Plus, anaerobic digestion produces less final sludge compared to aerobic processes. Those methanogenic archaea are quite inefficient. Metabolically, they need to eat a lot more organic matter to make a little bit of biomass.
But you said it's delicate. What's the risk?
It's a balanced ecosystem in that digester. If the earlier fermentation steps produce acids too fast, or if hydrogen gas builds up, the pH can drop sharply, and that acidic condition inhibits the methanogens. They stop working, the whole process crashes, and you get what operators dread, a stuck digester. It's like killing your sourdough starter.
Okay, so careful monitoring is key there. What about the water itself after secondary treatment? Is it clean enough?
Often there's one more step, tertiary treatment. This focuses mainly on removing leftover nutrients, specifically nitrogen, N, and phosphorus, P. If you release water with too much N and P into rivers or lakes, it can cause eutrophication.
Right, those big algal blooms that choke out other life. How do microbes help remove N and P?
Clever microbial manipulation. For phosphorus removal, they often cycle the microbes between tanks with oxygen, oxic, and tanks without oxygen, anoxic. This encourages certain bacteria to suck up and store large amounts of phosphate inside their cells. For nitrogen removal, they rely on denitrification. Under anoxic conditions, certain microbes use nitrate, a form of nitrogen, instead of oxygen for respiration, converting it into harmless nitrogen gas, N2, which just bubbles out into the atmosphere.
That's pretty elegant. So after all this treatment, how do they measure how clean the water actually is, especially regarding the leftover organic stuff? You mentioned 3 tests.
Yes, 3 common ways to measure the organic load: TOC, COD, and BOD. It's important to know what each tells you. TOC is total organic carbon,
Meaning,
meaning it measures all the carbon atoms tied up in organic molecules, period. Doesn't matter if it's easily digestible sugar or a piece of plastic, it's just the total amount.
okay. Then COD, chemical oxygen demand.
Right. HACOD measures how much organic material can be oxidized, basically burned, using a strong chemical oxidizing agent. It's faster than BOD, but it might not react with some really stubborn organic compounds like lignin from wood, for example.
Got it. And the last one, BOD, biochemical oxygen demand.
BOD is arguably the most relevant from an ecological standpoint. It measures how much oxygen the actual microbial community in the receiving water will consume while breaking down the organic matter in the sample over a set time, usually 5 days. It tells you how much food is available for the microbes in the environment.
So a high BOD in the treated water means it could still suck all the oxygen out of the river it's released into.
Precisely. That's why BOD limits on effluent are so critical for protecting aquatic life.
Quickly, what about home systems, like septic tanks? How do they fit in?
A conventional septic system is basically a mini 2-stage wastewater treatment plant. The tank itself acts like a simple anaerobic digester. Solids settle, and anaerobic microbes liquefy some of the organic matter. Then the liquid flows out into the leach field, which is essentially an aerobic biological filter. As the water percolates through the soil, aerobic microbes break down remaining organics, and particles get trapped. That's why it's crucial the leach field doesn't get waterlogged or flooded. You need oxygen for that aerobic breakdown to happen properly.
Okay, we saw microbes making methane as a byproduct, but now you're saying we can design systems where energy is the main goal, like microbial fuel cells, MFCs.
Exactly. This is really cutting-edge stuff. MFCs are like biological batteries. The basic idea is you have microbes, heterotrophs, breaking down organic matter anaerobically without oxygen. But instead of using an internal molecule to dump their electrons onto, they transfer those electrons outside the cell onto an electrode, the anode.
So the microbes are literally generating electricity.
They're generating an electrical current. It's fascinating. Some bacteria, like Shionella oneidensis, are particularly good at this. They actually grow tiny conductive protein filaments, like biological nanowires, to shuttle electrons directly to the anode surface. The potential here is huge. Purify water and generate power at the same time. Plus, MFCs might help drive bioremediation underground.
Which brings us to bioremediation, using microbes to clean up pollutants. What does successful biodegradation look like?
Well, there are different levels. Sometimes it's just a minor change to the pollutant molecule. Other times it's fragmentation, breaking it into smaller pieces. But the ideal outcome, the gold standard, is mineralization. That means the microbes completely break down the pollutant into simple, harmless inorganic things like carbon dioxide and water.
A lot of nasty industrial pollutants have things like chlorine atoms on them, right? Like PCE, TCE, PCBs. How do microbes start breaking those down?
That often requires a crucial first step called reductive dehalogenation. It usually happens under anaerobic conditions. Microbes essentially perform chemical surgery. They remove a halogen atom, like chlorine, and add electrons in the process. There are a couple of ways they do this. One is hydrogenolysis, where a hydrogen atom replaces the halogen. Another is dihaloelimination, where 2 adjacent halogens are removed and a double bond forms in the molecule. The key is, once you get those halogens off, the leftover carbon structure is usually much easier for other microbes in the community to degrade further.
But you have to be careful, right? Doesn't the breakdown sometimes create new problems?
Absolutely. That's the toxic twist. Degradation isn't always detoxification. Sometimes the intermediate products are just as bad or even worse. The classic example is DDT, the insecticide. It can be metabolized into DDE, which is also a persistent toxin, or TCE, a common solvent, under anaerobic conditions, can be turned into vinyl chloride, which is a known carcinogen. So monitoring the whole process, not just the disappearance of the original pollutant, is critical.
So how do we actually do bioremediation in the field? Do we just rely on the microbes already there?
Often, yes. That's called stimulating endogenous microbes. The Exxon Valdez oil spill cleanup is a prime example. Scientists realized the native Alaskan microbes that could eat oil were already there, but they were limited by nutrients. So they added nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer to the beaches. That simple addition dramatically sped up the natural oil degradation process by feeding the existing microbial community.
Sometimes you hear about cometabolism. What's that?
Cometabolism is interesting. It's when a microbe only breaks down a difficult recalcitrant pollutant if it also has an easier food source available, like glucose. It kind of degrades the nasty stuff on the side while primarily eating the good stuff. It highlights that cleaning up pollution is rarely about one supermicrobe. It's usually a complex community effort. You have primary degraders, secondary consumers eating the byproducts, maybe microbes producing biosurfactants to help dissolve the pollutant, even viruses playing a role by preying on certain bacteria. It's an ecosystem.
What if the native microbes just aren't up to the job, or the pollution is too overwhelming?
Then the alternative strategy is bioaugmentation. That's when you deliberately add specific microbial cultures, often commercially prepared ones known to degrade that particular pollutant. These are usually supplied as a slurry, often mixed with extra nutrients, enzymes, or surfactants to give them a fighting chance to establish and work in that contaminated environment.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground, from making drinking water safe with things like flocculation and filtration to the multi-stage process of wastewater treatment that's so vital for public health, and even generating methane energy from sludge, building micro-powered batteries, and using microbial communities to tackle tough pollutants like oil or chlorinated solvents.
And if you take a step back, there's a really fundamental thread tying almost all of this together. Redox chemistry. Managing electrons. Think about it. Keeping an anaerobic digester stable means preventing a buildup of electron donors, like hydrogen or acids. Cleaning up chlorinated solvents often requires reductive dehalogenation, adding electrons. Stimulating oil degradation might mean ensuring there's enough oxygen and electron acceptor. It really all boils down to carefully managing the flow of electrons, balancing the donors and acceptors in that microbial environment. That's the key to successful environmental microbial management.
It really is all about electrons, isn't it? Even in the messiest places. It gives you a new appreciation for those invisible microbial engineers constantly at work all around us, keeping the cycles of life, waste, and even energy turning over.